While Michelangelo was working on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, there was another artist who was working on another set of paintings for the Vatican, for the Pope, in the Pope's private apartments, and this guy was Raphael. So Raphael is kind of a competitor, but at the same time, he championed Michelangelo a little bit, and so we'll talk about that in some ways. The apartments or rooms that Raphael decorated are called the Stanza della Signoratura. And the main fresco that is important for most art history surveys is called the School of Athens. And it's this kind of weird painting that relates to classical philosophy and humanism and makes almost no reference to Catholicism in any significant way, but it's clearly meant to be related to what's going on in the Renaissance in the Catholic Church. And so first of all, we can, I guess, approach this from a formal point of view and discuss it from that. The first thing you'll probably notice is that there's a lot of decoration surrounding the fresco. And at the base of the fresco, you see these monochromatic trompe-l'oeil sculptures and little scenes that are supporting the fresco underneath it, kind of like what we saw in the School of Athens. So we have trompe-l'oeil architecture depicted around it, including the archway. Then when you look a little bit closer at the fresco, you can see that there's trompe-l'oeil architecture actually in that painted archway. We see this sort of weird Greek key that runs around the archway that's all painted. And then we see something that looks a little bit like the decorations from the Arapakis, which are these sort of garlands and vines that run up on these sort of pilasters that run to the left and the right of the fresco. And you enter into the fresco, and the first thing that I want you to notice is that it's done in one point perspective, like a lot of the frescoes and paintings that we've looked at before. The vanishing point and the horizon line run right through the center of the picture and sort of terminate behind these two center figures' heads. And so not one figure is being delineated by the vanishing point. It's kind of almost like the vanishing point is a division between the left and the right-hand sides of the painting. And you can see in the floor mosaic that one point perspective is paid attention to, and that there are these ideas concerning illusionism with the coffers in the ceiling and the perspective of the panels on the floor and the mosaic. And there's only one place actually where two-point perspective is being used, which is actually the block of stone that that figure in the foreground is leaning on, which is actually in two-point perspective. Now, the other thing that I wanted to discuss in some depth is the idea that what we're seeing here is a little bit of a double identity for each one of the characters in the paintings. And this ties in sort of a cross between context and iconography. The cross between iconography and context comes with this idea that Raphael was making reference and heroicizing some of the other artists that he knew from the Renaissance. And in particular, what we see here is this self-portrait by Leonardo that we looked at before, and it looks an awful lot like this character on the left-hand side. I'm not sure who the character on the right-hand side is, but the interpretation of this is Leonardo in sort of the guise or the identity of Plato. And the other character is Aristotle, and he's pointing down. So we've got this Platonic versus Aristotelian point of view, and in some ways that's also a depiction of the Dionysian Apollonian point of view. And what I'm talking about is Plato pointed up to the ideal and sort of spiritual and idealistic world, where Aristotle was more about the earth sciences and studying things in that way. So in some ways we have this sort of lay or this sort of overview of philosophy and history at the same time, as well as celebrity, if you will. And we have an Apollonian Dionysian conflict in this discussion. Now, there's other sort of product placement or placement of celebrity within this fresco. In the lower right-hand corner of the fresco, there are a series of figures, and we can see these names that some of you may have heard of: Zoroaster, Ptolemy, who's a geometer, Raphael, who's the painter, and another painter named Sodoma, who was named Sodoma because basically that's what his sexual proclivities were. If you zoom in a little bit, which you can actually see is that Raphael has kind of placed himself in the painting. And in this way, it's kind of like Alfred Hitchcock when he does cameos in his own works, where he does a sort of walk on when he's being when he designs a film or a scene where he's kind of showing himself, and we're supposed to nod and go, "Oh, there he is." And the same thing happens in other areas in this painting where there are important characters who are being depicted, and we'll return to that in just a second. So what I'd like to suggest to you is that what Raphael is doing is he's learning from actually almost recent history. For him, it's only about 100 years, where Masaccio does something similar to what Raphael is doing, but Raphael has improved on the special effects. And what I'm suggesting is when Masaccio paints the Trinity with donors, kind of places the viewer just outside the picture plane as if they could enter into it using a Roman triumphal arch. And you can see the same kind of coffers, although see Raphael kind of takes it to the next level and makes it a little bit more complex. And the Roman triumphal arch is meant to sort of focus you in on who the main characters are. Then sort of the hierarchy of characters, God the Father is in the center, Jesus who is just below him, and then you have Mary and St. John the evangelist, and then the patrons on the outskirts. And what I'm kind of suggesting is Raphael kind of does the same thing, where he places the two giants of philosophy in the center of the picture with the horizon line running through them and the vanishing point just between them, more or less. And we've got Plato and Aristotle. And then the other characters who are sort of less important kind of tend towards the outskirts, and notice that Raphael puts himself on the outskirts. This division also the perspective and this division also kind of lets you to see that the left-hand side is kind of where he's placing the more Dionysian people, and on the right-hand side he's placing the more Apollonian kind of people. And that references the two sculptures in the niches as well. For want of better terms, in the upper left-hand corner of Raphael's School of Athens, what you'll see is a sculpture that kind of represents Dionysus. And in the upper right-hand corner, you'll also see a sculpture of what looks like Minerva or Apollo. And so what we've got is he's literally referencing the rational versus not necessarily the irrational, but more the ecstatic and the ideal world versus the physical and real world. So it's the ideal world versus the physical sciences. And he's doing this, he's framing it with architecture to do that kind of thing and placing and creating a hierarchy in this way. And I suppose the last chunk of looking at this fresco would be taking it to the idea that there's a reference to current events in this fresco and relating current events to humanism, to a classical perspective, and to a Christian and Catholic perspective. And we can start first by taking a look at the figure that is leaning on that block of stone that is in two-point perspective. When Raphael was working on the Vatican apartments, he snuck in to see the Sistine Chapel ceiling and was so impressed with Michelangelo's work that he decided to put him in. And notice he's kind of putting him in the center, but he does something that sets him off from the rest of the characters throughout there. He depicts him as a character named Heraclitus, who's a mathematician and a geometer. And in terms of sculpture and painting, that's kind of what Michelangelo is. He kind of thinks about these worlds in that way. And he leans him on this block of stone that's in two-point perspective. And remember when we talked about Michelangelo, one of the things that we discussed about him was that he was kind of moody and a little bit separate from other people. And we get that sense when we're looking at this sculpture or this painting of the sculptor leaning on the block of stone. The other thing that he's doing is there's no real references to Christianity, even though this is painted inside basically a Christian church in the Pope's apartments. And what I'm kind of saying to you is they're saying in this painting, or Raphael is saying about the world he lives in then, is that they are the descendants of the Roman and Greco-Roman philosophical and intellectual tradition, and that all of these ideas relate to Christian thought and Catholic thought at that point in time. And he's doing this visually, but he's also relating these sort of giants who are almost like the saints, these painters who are the saints of Renaissance art, to this tradition as well. And I think that it was in a way taking the schema that Masaccio and other earlier painters worked with incorporating patrons and upping it and changing the schema and correcting it and adding some extra things to it that would make it more interesting and more complex for a later audience that was more interested in complexity and ideas at that point in time.